Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. So, I guess this is the part where my whole world fell apart. It was supposed to be a regular family reunion, one of those yearly get-togethers where you smile, eat too much, and listen to your relatives tell the same old stories. I wasn't exactly excited, but you show up because that's what you do for family. My wife, Amelia, was buzzing with excitement, as she always does at these things. She's the social butterfly type, you know? Always in the middle of the crowd, laughing just a little too loud. Anyway, we had our twin sons with us, Max and Nate. They're 14 and the lights of my life. I'm a high school history teacher, so I guess I'm a sucker for teaching, guiding, and honestly, just watching them grow up. I always thought we had a solid family, nothing extraordinary but good enough to be proud of. The reunion was at Amelia's cousin Mike's house. I never liked Mike. He's one of those guys who's always got some sleazy story about how he closed a deal or made a killing in real estate. He wears his shirts one size too small to show off muscles that scream midlife crisis, and he's always had this smirk that rubs me the wrong way. I brushed it off though. Amelia said I was overthinking. The evening started fine. Drinks, barbecue, awkward hugs with distant relatives. But then I started noticing something. Mike and Amelia were off. They weren't just catching up, they had this weird energy between them. You ever get that gut feeling where you know something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it? Yeah, that. At one point, I saw Mike lean in close to whisper something in Amelia's ear. She laughed, her hand brushing his arm. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was too familiar. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that I was being insecure. But then came the moment that shattered everything. I was standing near the grill, talking to Amelia's dad, when I overheard two of her cousins talking. They didn't know I was there, and one of them, half-drunk, muttered, "Can you believe it? 15 years and Mark still has no clue." The other one snorted, "Well, Mike's always been good at keeping secrets." I felt my stomach drop. I turned to them and asked, "What are you talking about?" My voice must have come out sharper than I intended because they both froze. One of them tried to backpedal, mumbling something about it being a joke. But it wasn't. I could see it in their faces. That's when I decided I wasn't leaving until I got answers. The rest of that night's a blur. Once I got a taste of the truth, I couldn't let it go. I kept scanning the room, watching Amelia and Mike like a hawk. Every touch, every look, it all seemed so obvious now. How had I been so blind? When the twins went off to play basketball with some of the other kids, I finally cornered Amelia. We were in the kitchen, away from everyone else. I didn't even bother with small talk. "What's going on between you and Mike?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, even though I could feel my heart pounding. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Mark, don't be ridiculous. He's my cousin. What are you even talking about?" But I wasn't buying it. "I overheard your cousins talking about secrets. About something you've been hiding for 15 years. Do you know what they meant?" That's when she froze. Her smile faltered, just for a second, but long enough for me to catch it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her tone had changed. It wasn't playful anymore. "I think you do," I said, stepping closer. "And I think you need to tell me now, Amelia, because I'm not leaving this house without answers." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the doorway like she was looking for an escape. That's when Mike walked in, holding a plate of ribs and grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. "What's going on here?" he asked, like he hadn't just walked into the middle of a ticking time bomb. "Why don't you tell me, Mike?" I shot back. 15 years. What the hell have you two been hiding from me for 15 years? His grin dropped immediately, and he looked at Amelia, then back at me. "Mark, you're overthinking this," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But I was done. Am I? Because I've got this nagging feeling that I'm not. So why don't one of you just come clean before I drag everyone into this? Amelia turned to Mike, her face pale. "Don't," she whispered. That's when I knew. "What don't you want him to say, Amelia?" I snapped, my voice echoing through the house. By then, a few people had started to gather, peeking into the kitchen to see what the commotion was about. Mike looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock, but Amelia, she started crying. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "I can explain." But she couldn't. There was no explanation that could fix this. What is it? I said, barely holding myself together. What is it you can't tell me? Her answer hit me like a freight train. Max and Nate, they're not yours. Mike is their father. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. The words didn't make sense, like my brain couldn't process them. But then they sank in. My knees felt weak, and I had to grab the counter to steady myself. What? Was all I could manage. It was a mistake, she sobbed. It only happened a few times, right after we got married. I didn't think you'd ever find out. Mike looked down at the floor, his jaw clenched. He didn't even try to deny it. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like the walls were closing in on me. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my family, it was all a lie. And the worst part? Everyone in the room now knew it too. I didn't even realize I'd left the kitchen until I found myself outside, standing in Mike's backyard. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, but it wasn't enough to clear my head. My mind was racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. 15 years. 15 years of lies, and now my entire life was unraveling in front of me. The twins, they weren't even mine. They weren't mine. I don't know how long I stood out there, staring at the stars like they might have some kind of answer. Eventually, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Amelia. Her face was red and streaked with tears, but I didn't feel anything. No pity, no sadness. Just a cold, empty rage. Mark, please, she started, her voice shaky. Let me explain. I held up my hand to stop her. Explain what? I snapped. Explain how you lied to me every single day for 15 years? Explain how you let me raise 2 boys, thinking they were mine, while you and Mike kept this sick little secret. Her face crumpled, and she started crying again, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. It wasn't like that, she said, choking on her words. It only happened a few times. I didn't think it would. I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared. Scared. I interrupted. Scared of what? Losing me? Because that's exactly what's happening right now, Amelia. You've already lost me. I turned to walk away, but she grabbed my arm. Please, Mark, she begged. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away. I love you. I've always loved you. Her words made me laugh, a bitter, hollow laugh. Love. I said, shaking my head. You don't get to use that word with me. Not anymore. I pulled away from her and headed back inside, only to run smack into Mike. He was standing in the hallway, looking like he wanted to disappear. The sight of him made my blood boil. You, I said, pointing at him. You ruined my life. You ruined my family. He didn't even try to defend himself. Mark, I'm sorry, he said quietly. I never meant for this to happen. Don't, I cut him off. Don't you dare act like this was some accident. You knew exactly what you were doing. I stepped closer, and he actually flinched. Good. He deserved to feel afraid. You're going to pay for this, I said, my voice low and steady. I don't know how yet, but I promise you, Mike, you're going to regret ever crossing me. I walked past him without another word, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't even say goodbye to the twins. I couldn't face them. Not yet. As I drove home, the anger turned to something heavier, darker. Betrayal. Loss. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I'd always prided myself on being the steady one, the guy people could count on. But now? I didn't even know who I was anymore. All I knew was that the life I'd built was over. And if Amelia and Mike thought they were going to walk away from this unscathed, they were wrong. Dead wrong. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, Amelia's tear-streaked expression, Mike's pathetic, guilty look. But what haunted me most were the boys. Max and Nate. I'd loved them, raised them, taught them everything I knew. And now, I didn't even know what to feel about them. By the time the sun came up, the anger had settled into something sharper. I wasn't going to let Amelia and Mike walk away from this. No. I'd spent my entire life playing by the rules, being the nice guy, the one who stayed calm and steady. But not anymore. This time, I was going to play dirty. The first step was simple. I needed to protect myself. I called a lawyer that morning, Eleanor, who'd helped one of my colleagues through a nasty divorce. She was sharp, no nonsense, and didn't waste time sugarcoating things. When I told her the situation, she didn't even flinch. "Okay," she said, her tone calm but firm. "The first thing we need to do is establish paternity for the boys. Without that, we're flying blind." The words stung, but I nodded. "And then what?" "Then," she said, leaning forward, "we make sure you're in the strongest position possible. Financially, legally, emotionally. If your wife and her cousin think they're getting out of this unscathed, they're in for a rude awakening." I liked her already. The next few days were a whirlwind. I stayed at a hotel and avoided all contact with Amelia and Mike. I needed space to think, to plan. Eleanor set up the paternity tests, and I submitted the samples. The results wouldn't take long, but I already knew what they'd say. Meanwhile, I started digging into Mike's life. I'd always known he was shady, bragging about deals and flaunting his success, but now I wanted specifics. It didn't take long to find some cracks in his shiny facade. A quick internet search turned up a few lawsuits against his real estate business, claims of fraud and unpaid debts. Interesting. I shared the info with Eleanor, and her eyes lit up. "If these lawsuits have merit, we might be able to use them to our advantage," she said. "You want to go after him? This could be your way in." I didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." Over the next week, Eleanor worked her magic, filing paperwork and making calls. We acquired some of Mike's debts and started looking into his properties. Turns out, his empire wasn't as solid as he liked to pretend. A lot of it was built on shaky deals and borrowed money. It was almost too easy to start dismantling it, piece by piece. In the middle of all this, Amelia tried to reach out. She called, texted, even showed up at the hotel once. I didn't answer. What was there to say? Every time I thought about her, all I felt was disgust. Then one night, she left me a voicemail. Her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying. "Mark, please. I know you're angry, but the boys," her voice cracked. "They need you. Please don't take this out on them. They're innocent in all this." I deleted the message. She was right about one thing though, the boys were innocent. But I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. I needed to figure out how I felt about them, about everything, before I could even think about being their father again. For now, I had a different mission, making sure Amelia and Mike paid for what they'd done. And I was just getting started. I don't know if you've ever tried to function on pure rage, but let me tell you, it's surprisingly effective. It was like I'd unlocked a part of myself I didn't even know existed. Every ounce of energy, every thought, went into the plan. I didn't care about sleeping or eating, I just wanted results. The paternity test results came back a few days later. Just as I expected, neither Max nor Nate was biologically mine. I stared at the paper for what felt like hours. Even though I'd known the truth deep down, seeing it written out like that was a punch to the gut. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just folded the paper, put it in my desk drawer, and added another layer of steel to the wall around my heart. Eleanor was all business when I told her. "This strengthens your case," she said, flipping through her notes. "If you want to cut ties financially, this is your ticket. But it also complicates things emotionally." "Yeah," I muttered. "Tell me something I don't know." She gave me a look, then softened. "Mark, I know this is hard. But you're handling it better than most people would." I didn't feel like I was handling anything. Meanwhile, the digging into Mike's business continued. Eleanor had her team combing through his finances, and the deeper we looked, the uglier it got. Fake appraisals, forged documents, unpaid contractors. It was like a treasure trove of bad decisions. We started acquiring more of his debts, slowly but surely tightening the noose. The best part? Mike had no idea. Amelia, on the other hand, wasn't so clueless. She must have realized I was up to something because she started reaching out more aggressively. Texts, voicemails, emails. She even left a handwritten letter at my hotel room. I didn't read it. Then one evening, she showed up at the hotel again. I was coming back from a meeting with Eleanor when I saw her sitting in the lobby. She looked tired, her makeup smudged like she'd been crying. "Mark," she said, standing up when she saw me. I sighed. "What are you doing here, Amelia?" "We need to talk," she said. "Please. Just 5 minutes." I didn't want to, but something in her voice stopped me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Either way, I followed her to a quiet corner of the lobby. "I know you hate me," she started, her voice shaking. I didn't say anything. But the boys, Mark, they don't understand what's happening. They don't know why you're not coming home, why you won't talk to them. They're confused and scared, and they miss you. My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. They miss me, I said. What about you, Amelia? Do you miss me too? Or are you just worried about how all this is going to affect you? She flinched like I'd slapped her. Of course I miss you, she said. I miss us. I miss the life we had. You mean the life you destroyed, I shot back. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Mark, I know I can't fix this, she said. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back. But please, for the boys, can we find a way to work through this? For their sake. I stood up. I'll think about it, I said, which was the biggest lie I'd told in years. And then I walked away. As I rode the elevator up to my room, I realized something. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. Amelia wanted to talk about the boys? Fine. I'd deal with that when the time came. But first, I had to finish what I'd started. Mike's world was going to come crashing down. And Amelia? She could watch it burn. It took about 2 weeks before Mike even realized something was wrong. By then, Eleanor and her team had locked down enough of his debts and liabilities to make his business look like a sinking ship. The beauty of it was that everything we did was legal. I wasn't breaking the rules. I was just using them to my advantage. Mike called me one evening. I hadn't spoken to him since the reunion, and just seeing his name on my phone made my blood boil. I let it ring, but he called again. Finally, I picked up. What do you want? I asked, my tone cold. Mark, he said, his voice tight. I don't know what's going on, but, are you involved in this? With my business? Because things are happening that don't make sense, and I cut him off. What's the matter, Mike? You finally realizing that shady deals come with consequences. There was silence on the other end. I warned you, I continued. I told you you'd regret crossing me. This is just the beginning. Mark, come on, he said, his voice breaking just a little. This isn't about business. We are family. We can figure this out. Family. I snapped, the word like acid in my mouth. You don't get to use that word with me, Mike. Not after what you did. Enjoy the fallout. I hung up before he could say another word. Over the next few days, things escalated. One of Mike's biggest clients pulled out of a deal after Eleanor's team sent them some anonymous tips about his fraudulent practices. A supplier sued him for unpaid invoices. By the time we were done, Mike's company was bleeding money. But I wasn't done yet. I started selling off the properties we'd acquired from his debts, making sure to price them low enough to hurt his market. Every move I made was deliberate, calculated. I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to watch everything he'd built crumble to dust. Amelia, of course, found out what was happening. She called me in a panic one evening. Mark, what are you doing? She demanded. Cleaning up some messes, I replied, my tone calm. You're destroying him, she said, her voice shaking. Do you really hate us that much? Hate you, I said, laughing bitterly. No, Amelia. I don't hate you. I don't feel anything for you. But Mike? He's getting exactly what he deserves. And the boys, she asked. Do they deserve this? They're scared, Mark. They think you're never coming back. Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. But I wasn't ready to face that yet. This isn't about them, I said. This is about you and Mike. Don't try to guilt me into stopping, because it won't work. She was crying now. You're not the man I married. No, I said. I'm not. That man is gone. You killed him. I hung up and stared at the phone for a long time. Part of me wanted to call her back, to yell, to scream, to let out all the pain I was bottling up. But I didn't. Instead, I poured another drink and went back to work. Mike's empire wasn't completely destroyed yet, but it was close. And I wasn't stopping until there was nothing left. It was bound to happen sooner or later. I'd been avoiding Max and Nate, telling myself I needed time to process everything. But deep down, I knew I couldn't hide from them forever. They were innocent in all this, no matter how much their existence now felt like a cruel joke. One evening, I got a text from Max. Max, Dad, can we please talk? Nate and I miss you. We just want to know what's going on. The word Dad hit me like a ton of bricks. They didn't know the truth. Amelia hadn't told them, probably hoping I'd come back and pretend nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I didn't respond right away. I sat there, staring at the message, my mind racing. Finally, I texted back. Let's meet tomorrow. Just the three of us. The next day, we met at a diner not far from their school. When I walked in and saw them sitting in the booth, my chest tightened. They looked nervous, unsure of what to expect. Max, the older twin by 5 minutes, gave me a tentative smile. Nate just looked down at his hands, fidgeting with a sugar packet. "Hey guys," I said, sliding into the booth. "Hey Dad," Max said softly. Nate mumbled a quiet hi but didn't look up. We sat there in awkward silence for a few moments before Max spoke up. "Are you and Mom okay?" he asked. "She won't tell us what's going on, but she cries a lot. And you're not coming home. Did we do something wrong?" The knot in my stomach tightened. "No, you didn't do anything wrong," I said quickly. "This has nothing to do with you." Nate finally looked up, his eyes wide. "Then what is it? Why are you mad at Mom?" I took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to explain something so complicated to two 14-year-olds. "Your mom and we've had some problems," I said carefully. "Big problems. And it's going to take some time to figure out what happens next." "Are you getting a divorce?" Max asked, his voice cracking. The question hit me harder than I expected. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But no matter what happens between your mom and me, it doesn't change how much I care about you guys." Nate's lip quivered. "Then why are you avoiding us? If you care about us, why did you leave?" His words broke something inside me. I wanted to tell them the truth, to scream that I wasn't their father, that their entire existence was built on a lie. But I couldn't. They didn't deserve that. "I needed time," I said instead, my voice thick. "This has been really hard for me, and I didn't want to take it out on you. But I'm here now, and I'll always be here for you. I promise." They both looked at me, their faces filled with a mix of confusion and relief. Max nodded slowly. "We just want things to go back to normal," he said. I forced a smile. "Me too, buddy. Me too." We talked a bit more after that, about school, their friends, basketball. For a little while, it almost felt normal. But as I watched them laugh and joke, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was hanging by a thread. I didn't know how to move forward. But for now, all I could do was try. The day after I met the boys, I got another message from Amelia. This time, she didn't bother with guilt or pleading. She went straight to anger. "Amelia, Mark, we need to talk. You can't just avoid me forever. This isn't just about you anymore." I ignored it at first. She didn't deserve my attention, not after everything she'd done. But a few hours later, she showed up at the hotel. I was sitting in the lounge, sipping coffee and going over some documents Eleanor had sent me about Mike's business, when I saw her walk in. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was pale, like she hadn't slept in days. She spotted me and marched over, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Mark," she said, her voice tight. I didn't even look up. "Amelia, I'm busy." "I don't care," she snapped. "We're talking. Now." She grabbed a chair and sat down across from me, glaring like she was daring me to stop her. I sighed and set the papers aside. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" she repeated, her voice rising. "I want to know what the hell you think you're doing. Destroying Mike's business? Avoiding me? Acting like the boys don't exist? This isn't you, Mark. You're not this person." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You don't know me, Amelia. Not anymore." Her face softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. "Maybe I don't," she admitted. "But I know you're better than this. You're a good man, Mark. A good father. The boys need you. Stop using them as an excuse," I said, my voice cold. "I talked to them yesterday. They're fine. They don't need you to speak for them." Her mouth opened, then closed again, like she didn't know what to say. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I know you're hurt. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. But Mark, what you're doing to Mike, it's cruel. It's not you." I laughed bitterly. "Cruel? You want to talk about cruelty, Amelia? How about lying to me for 15 years? Letting me believe Max and Nate were mine while you and Mike kept this disgusting secret? How about that? Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't stop. "You're lucky I'm only going after his business," I said. "Because if I had my way, you'd both lose everything." She reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Mark, please. I'll do anything to make this right. Anything. Just tell me what I need to do." I stared at her hand for a long moment before finally meeting her eyes. "There's nothing you can do, Amelia. Nothing." Her face crumpled, and she pulled her hand back, clutching it to her chest like I'd slapped her. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I do," I said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She sat there for a few seconds, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she stood up, her shoulders shaking. "I never wanted this, Mark," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't respond. She turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my coffee and my rage. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I thought about everything she'd done, everything she'd taken from me. No. She deserved this. And I wasn't done yet. A week after my confrontation with Amelia, the cracks in Mike's life started to show publicly. Eleanor had made sure the lawsuits and financial struggles were impossible to keep under wraps. It wasn't long before word got out, and his so-called business partners began jumping ship. He tried to spin it, of course. Mike's always been good at talking his way out of things. But this time, he wasn't dealing with a clueless investor or a gullible client. This time, he was dealing with me. The final nail in the coffin came when we acquired one of his most valuable properties, a commercial building in the middle of the city. I made sure to undercut his asking price so badly it sent ripples through the local market. It was a calculated move, designed to show everyone just how unstable his empire really was. The day the deal closed, I got a call from Mike. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What?" I said, not bothering to hide the disdain in my voice. "You've made your point," he said, his voice strained. "You've destroyed my business, Mark. Are you happy now?" "Not yet," I replied. "But I'm getting there." He let out a bitter laugh. "You've always been the quiet one, the guy who stays in his lane. I guess I underestimated you." "You're not the first," I said. "And you won't be the last." There was a long pause on the line before he spoke again. "What do you want, Mark? Money? An apology? What's it going to take to make this stop?" I leaned back in my chair, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "What I want is for you to lose everything, Mike. Just like you and Amelia made me lose everything." "That's not fair," he said, his voice rising. "This isn't just about you, you know. The boys." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't you dare bring them into this. You don't get to use them as leverage." For the first time, he sounded genuinely desperate. "They're my sons, Mark. No matter what you think of me, they're still my sons." "They were mine first," I said quietly. "And you stole them from me." He started to say something else, but I hung up. Later that evening, I met with Eleanor to go over the next steps. She'd found even more dirt on Mike's business practices, enough to ensure that he wouldn't be able to rebuild, even if he tried. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "This will completely ruin him." "That's the point," I said. She nodded, but there was something in her expression that made me pause. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," she said quickly. Then, after a moment, she added, "Just, don't lose yourself in this, Mark. Revenge can be a dark road." Her words stuck with me as I drove home that night. Was I losing myself? Maybe. But at this point, I didn't care. All I cared about was making sure Mike and Amelia never forgot the consequences of their betrayal. I knew the day would come when Max and Nate would need to know the truth. I dreaded it, turning the conversation over and over in my head, but no amount of preparation could make it easier. The more I delayed, the more it felt like I was betraying them all over again. A week after my last conversation with Mike, I decided it was time. I called Amelia and told her to meet me at the park near our old house. I didn't want the boys to hear this from anyone else, least of all her. She arrived first, looking worn and anxious. When Max and Nate showed up, I could see the confusion in their eyes. They still didn't understand why their parents weren't talking, why their family felt like it was falling apart. We sat on a bench near the basketball court, the same one where I used to watch them play when they were little. "Dad, what's going on?" Max asked. "Why are we here?" I glanced at Amelia, whose face was pale and drawn. She nodded slightly, giving me the signal to start. I took a deep breath. There's something you need to know, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Something your mom and I should have told you a long time ago. Nate looked nervous, his hands fidgeting in his lap. What is it? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Finally, I said it. Max, Nate. I'm not your biological father. The silence that followed was deafening. Max stared at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. Nate's face twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? Max finally said, his voice cracking. Of course you're our dad. I raised you, I said quickly. I'll always be your dad in every way that matters. But biologically, you're not mine. Mike is your father. It was like the air had been sucked out of the world. Nate's eyes filled with tears, and Max's face turned bright red. Mike. Max said, his voice rising. Mom's cousin Mike? That guy. Amelia reached for him, but he pulled away. Max, I can explain. Explain what? He yelled, standing up. That you cheated on Dad? That you lied to us our whole lives? Nate buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I wanted to reach out to him to comfort him, but I felt like I had no right. Why are you telling us this now? Max demanded, glaring at me. Because you deserve the truth, I said. You deserve to know where you come from. Max let out a bitter laugh. Where we come from? Great. So we come from a lie. Thanks for that. He grabbed Nate's arm. Come on, let's go. Max, wait, I started, but he didn't even look at me. They walked off, leaving me and Amelia sitting there in silence. She wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. We shouldn't have told them like that, she said. They needed to know, I replied, my voice hard. They're just kids, she said, her voice breaking. You've turned their whole world upside down. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. No, Amelia. You did that. Don't put this on me. I walked away without another word, leaving her sitting alone on the bench. As I drove home, my mind raced. I didn't know if the boys would ever forgive me, or if I could forgive myself for telling them the truth. But at least now they knew. The next step? Making sure Mike knew exactly what he'd done to their lives. After telling the boys, I realized there was still unfinished business. Mike needed to face the consequences, not just the ones I'd orchestrated, but the personal fallout of what he'd done. He might have destroyed my life, but he wasn't walking away from this without understanding the full weight of his actions. I didn't call ahead. I showed up at his office unannounced, the chaos in his business evident the moment I stepped inside. Phones were ringing, staff whispered frantically, and Mike's assistant looked ready to cry. Is he in? I asked her. She nodded nervously. He's on a call, but... I didn't wait for her to finish. I walked past her desk and into Mike's office. He was sitting at his desk, his tie loosened and his hair a mess. When he saw me, he froze mid-sentence on the phone. I'll call you back, he muttered, hanging up. Mark, he said, standing up. What are you? Sit down, I said, my tone sharp. He hesitated, then slowly sank back into his chair. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my arms crossed. You've had your fun, Mike, I said. But now it's time to talk about the damage you've done. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I know you're angry, but... Angry? I interrupted. That doesn't even begin to cover it. You didn't just betray me, Mike. You betrayed Max and Nate. You ruined their lives, their sense of identity, because you couldn't keep your hands off my wife. His face paled, and he looked down at his desk. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said quietly. Spare me the excuses, I snapped. You made a choice, Mike. A selfish, disgusting choice. And now my boys, the boys I raised, have to live with the fallout of your mistakes. I love them too, he said, looking up at me. They're my sons, Mark. They're not yours, I said, cutting him off. You might share DNA, but you didn't raise them. You didn't teach Max how to shoot a basketball or help Nate with his science fair project. You didn't sit by their beds when they were sick or cheer for them at their games. That was me. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. You don't get to play the victim here, I continued. And you definitely don't get to waltz back into their lives like nothing happened. What do you want from me, Mark? He asked, his voice strained. I want you to own up to what you've done, I said. I want you to look Max and Nate in the eyes and tell them the truth. Not some sugar-coated version to make yourself look better, the real truth. They deserve that much." He nodded slowly. "Okay. I'll do it." "Good," I said, heading for the door. "And Mike? Stay out of my way. Because if you try to interfere with my family again, I promise you, I'll finish what I started." I left without waiting for a response, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But at least now, Mike knew exactly where he stood. A few days after my confrontation with Mike, he reached out to Max and Nate. True to his word, he sat them down and told them the truth about his relationship with Amelia and his role as their biological father. I wasn't there, I couldn't bring myself to be, but Max told me about it later. "He looked like a wreck," Max said when we spoke over the phone. "Like worse than I've ever seen him. He kept saying how sorry he was and how much he regretted everything." "What did you say?" I asked, bracing myself for the answer. Max was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told him I didn't want anything to do with him." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. I knew it wasn't my fault, but I couldn't help feeling responsible for the pain they were going through. "What about Nate?" I asked. "He barely said anything," Max replied. "Just sat there, staring at the floor. When we left, he told me he doesn't care who our real dad is. You're the one who raised us." I had to swallow hard to keep my voice steady. "I'm glad he feels that way." "Me too," Max said. "But I don't know how I feel yet. It's just so messed up, you know." "I know," I said quietly. "And it's okay to feel however you feel, Max. There's no right or wrong way to deal with this." After he hung up, I sat in my empty apartment, staring at the wall. For the first time in weeks, the anger that had been driving me started to fade, replaced by something heavier. Guilt. Not for what I'd done to Mike, he deserved every bit of it, but for the boys. They were caught in the middle of something they didn't ask for, forced to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. It wasn't fair. Later that evening, I met with Eleanor to discuss the next steps. We'd done significant damage to Mike's business, but now that the dust was settling, she wanted to know how far I was willing to go. "You've made your point," she said, tapping her pen against the table. "Mike's reputation is in tatters, his finances are a mess, and he's lost most of his major clients. We can keep pushing, but at this point, you've already won." "Have I?" I asked, my voice heavy. She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's the point of all this?" I said, gesturing vaguely. "Mike's business is falling apart, Amelia's a wreck, and the boys," my voice caught. "The boys are hurting. What have I actually accomplished?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Sometimes winning doesn't feel like winning," she said. "But you've taken control, Mark. You've shown them they can't walk all over you." I nodded, but her words didn't bring the satisfaction they should have. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the revenge, the chaos I'd unleashed. I'd done what I set out to do, destroyed Mike's life and forced Amelia to face the consequences of her actions. But at what cost? The boys were the only thing that mattered now. And if I wanted to be the father they deserved, I needed to start thinking about the future. It was time to stop looking back and start building something new. Deciding to shift my focus from revenge to rebuilding wasn't easy. For weeks, my anger had been my compass, guiding every decision. But the more I thought about Max and Nate, the more I realized they needed me to be something other than a man consumed by bitterness. The next morning, I called Amelia. She sounded surprised to hear from me. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. "We need to talk," I said. "About the boys. About what happens next." She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near the school. When I arrived, she was already there, nursing a cup of tea and looking like she hadn't slept in days. "I want to make one thing clear," I said as I sat down. "This isn't about us. This is about them. They're my priority now." "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm not coming back, Amelia," I continued. "There's no fixing what you've done. But I'll always be there for Max and Nate. That's never going to change." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. We talked for over an hour, hashing out logistics. How we'd handle custody, how we'd communicate about school and activities, how we'd navigate the mess we'd created. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in weeks, we were on the same page about something. Afterward, I met with Max and Nate. We went to the park, just the three of us, and I told them what I'd decided. Your mom and I aren't getting back together, I said. But that doesn't mean I'm going anywhere. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. Max nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Nate leaned into my side, resting his head on my shoulder. I know things are hard right now, I said. But we'll get through this. Together. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. In the midst of all this, Eleanor had become an unexpected source of support. Our meetings, which had started as strictly professional, began to feel more personal. She was sharp, focused, and unflinchingly honest, qualities I'd come to admire. One evening, after wrapping up another round of paperwork, she invited me to grab a drink. You could use a break, she said, giving me a small smile. I hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I could. We ended up at a quiet bar, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about her career, her passion for helping people take control of their lives, and the sacrifices she'd made along the way. I told her about teaching, about how much I'd loved being a dad, and how lost I'd felt since everything fell apart. You're stronger than you think, she said, her gaze steady. Not everyone could go through what you've been through and come out on the other side. Some days I don't feel strong, I admitted. That's because you're human, she said. But you're still standing. That counts for something. As the evening went on, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. For the first time since the reunion, I felt like I could breathe again. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future worth building after all. My life was starting to take shape again, slowly but surely. The boys and I settled into a new routine, one where honesty and stability were the foundation. Max was still guarded, but he'd started opening up little by little. Nate was more affectionate, constantly seeking reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere. Eleanor and I continued to see each other, first under the guise of work, but it became clear there was something more between us. She was patient, never pushing, but always there when I needed a listening ear or a grounding presence. One evening, she came over for dinner. It was the first time she'd met Max and Nate, and I could tell they were nervous. But within minutes, Eleanor had them laughing, swapping stories about her awkward teen years and her horrible attempts at cooking when she first moved out on her own. When she left that night, Max turned to me. She's cool, he said. Yeah, I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. She is.